Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this week's podcast. And I'm delighted to be welcomed by our special guest today, Sam Flood. Good afternoon, Sam. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon, Matt. Yes, I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Very, very welcome. Podcast listeners, thank you for joining us. And of course, today's podcast is about a very important topic, very timely, very relevant, and something that is absolutely on the rise. And that's around parental complaints. So the title of today's podcast is Why Complaints Are Rising and What Can Schools and Mats Do About It? So why complaints are rising and what schools can do about it. That's today's podcast. And for a little bit of context, Sam is very much one of the experts in this particular sphere. Hence, Sam is joining us today. So, Sam, on that note, it'd be lovely to learn a little bit about yourself. If you want to tell us a little bit about you, your background, your expertise, and that'd be a nice scene setter, if that's all right, Sam.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks, Matt. As I say, I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this topic. And any expertise I have on this particular issue are not my own. They have been shared with me by head teachers and MAT leaders and governance teams and anyone working at a senior level at a school. And to start with, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of Companion, which is a platform that helps schools and multi-academy trusts manage complaints more smoothly. And my background is in scaling early stage startups, particularly in tech. Before that, I was a consultant for my sins. And for the past year, I've been working almost exclusively with head teachers and MAT leaders and anyone in a senior role in a school to understand the reality of parental complaints in schools. And to be honest, Companion came out of those conversations. My background is not in education, but I went and spoke to those people who care about these issues. And anyone who spent any time with a head teacher recently, perhaps a friend or a colleague or even a family member, they'd be able to tell you the same things that I'm going to tell you. And so when we set out to start building Companion, we kept hearing the same themes, which was that complaints and concerns from parents were rising in schools. They were not only rising, but they were becoming more complex. And the expectations from parents were changing. And it was creating stress and inconsistency and a completely unenjoyable situation for everybody involved. And so that's why myself and Jack and some really experienced investors in EdTech have come together to build Companion to give schools a clearer, calmer space to manage these concerns and complaints early. We want to help them stay compliant. And overall, we want to save leaders time and stress. And so that's how Companion came around. And the whole idea is to take a really painful, admin-heavy process and make it feel manageable again.
Thanks, Sam. And I think I always like to start podcasts, and I think is the most important question, which is the why question. And I think I'd like to start with that today, is why are parental complaints on the rise? And obviously it's brilliant that you're able to bring to the podcast, as you've said already, feedback, observations, comments, learning, sharings from multi-academy trust leaders, head teachers. What is that why? Why do they feel? Why are they sharing? What are we learning? Why are parental complaints on the rise, Sam?
Yeah, and I think it is fair to assume that they are rising. I've not really met anyone who says that they're not, even those schools that are dealing with complaints really well or are a very small primary school that don't get a lot of complaints by comparison to a big academy. I think would all agree that over the last 5 years, complaints are becoming more frequent and becoming more complicated. And I don't think that's just across education either. I think it's across the entirety of public life. I think we'll obviously look at education primarily today, but a lot of these reasons could be applied elsewhere. I would say it's never one thing, of course, with these problems. It's never one cause. I think I'd probably start by talking about parents, because the whole thing comes from parents. There wouldn't be complaints if there weren't parents. And so I think it's important to reflect the fact that parents today are much more engaged and far more empowered than maybe they were previously, or certainly feel more empowered. Their expectations from parents in generations gone by would be very different, and their ability to exercise that engagement is very different as well. Parents expect quick responses, much quicker now than they may be used to. and the way they expect that response is different. Normally it would be maybe in the past a chat over the school gate, but now obviously with technology it can be much easier to voice their dissatisfaction, and also they want that response much quicker than maybe a chat at the end of the week would have sufficed in the past. They want consistent updates, they want clarity over decisions, and I think, and I'm hesitant to use this word, but I think they expect a level of customer service maybe, and schools might not enjoy me using that word, but there's no doubt that parents feel that that's what they are owed in lots of cases. And this isn't an opportunity to bash parents. It's just the reality of the world we live in. I think it's also really difficult to talk about complaints without talking about special educational needs. I think that's a huge driver of a lot of complaints, and is a symptom that is almost indicative of the problem, which is that parents of children feel they want support and feel that they want intervention for their child, but that the system can't deal with it. And I think that drives me on to the second point I would make, is that at the time of parents' expectations rising, school budgets are lowering. And that obviously creates an incredibly difficult situation where leaders of schools have less time, they have fewer resources, they have fewer admin staff, and more operational pressure than ever. So you've got a rising demand on one side of the equation, matched up against a shrinking capacity on the other side of the equation. And even with schools with fantastic relationships are going to find that really difficult. So that's the second thing I talk about. And then you can't talk about complaints without talking about COVID. So if you've got a situation where parents' expectations are really high and school budgets are lower than ever, then and then you add COVID as the kind of lighting of the touch paper, the problem becomes even clearer. People are more willing to escalate things more quickly. Parents got used to being much more directly involved in their child's education. Issues around behaviour were heightened for children in school. Obviously, the playing field changed from being basically level when all children were in school at the same time to some children getting a much better homeschooling experience than others. And that disparity obviously led to enormous difficulties in a lot of areas. And so what you're left with is a perfect storm where you've got more issues, you've got the ability for faster escalation from parents, you've got higher expectations, and you've got less internal capacity to deal with it, all while trying to navigate a post-COVID world, which ultimately changed a child's education, at least for a couple of years, if not longer. And that's really the backdrop for Companion, is that schools have suddenly they haven't become worse at dealing with complaints, it's that the environment has changed around them. And the volume, complexity, expectations has all changed. And that's what we're trying to help them solve, is not kind of solve the problem of complaints, but give schools a more up-to-date way of dealing with those complaints that takes into account all of the things that have changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Thanks, Sam. That's really interesting. And a couple of things, obviously, we've done our research prior to this podcast today, and a couple of things that came out from our research and investigations were, and again, you touch on this when you use the word managing expectation, is that parents are more likely in this day and age to escalate an escalation.
Yes.
As well, which has come through from our research, not being satisfied with the response necessarily and continuing to drive that complaint, that escalation up the hierarchy to a particular point. I think that came through strongly. And another thing from our research was, and again from head teachers dealing with very, very difficult, complex parental situations, is the length of time which they have kindly shared with us being longer than it's ever been in many, many years gone by. And again, because of the level of detail involved, backwards and forwards, trying to resolve, trying to navigate challenging, sticky, complex situations and complaints and escalations. So that came through from our research as well ahead of today. Sam, just kind of a slightly different next question, slightly different aspect, I guess, is from a MAT or a school leader, and I just shared from a head teacher's perspective, or the main stakeholder within a school that manages parental complaints day to day, week to week, term to term. From their perspective, managing complaints, what are the vast array of challenges that those individuals have? I mean, the one that obviously sticks out to me is the incredible stress involved in managing complaints. So if we can just talk about those, what does that look like?
Well, they're very varied. Yeah, you mentioned stress, and I think that is obviously one side of the challenge. There's the other side, which is more operational, but I think the emotional side is something that people don't talk enough about, because this is causing huge emotional stress for a lot of head teachers, and is often a reason why people are leaving the profession. And in some ways, you can't blame them if they're waking up at 2 a.m. to check their emails because they've had a really aggressive complaint from a parent and they don't know quite how to deal with it. Then it's understandable that you might look for an alternative career path. The level of training to deal with those situations, incidentally, is basically zero. And I think that's something that a lot of head teachers feel they might want more support on. But to talk about the actual issues and challenges that schools and MATs are facing, we talked about why complaints are rising. How is that impacting schools, and how is that impacting trust? How is it making their life more difficult, essentially? At a basic level, I think most schools are still managing complaints manually. And what does that mean? That means they're using inboxes, spreadsheets, they might be using Word, they might be using SharePoint, all of the existing tools they've got that they are then jury rigging to kind of make that relevant to complaints. And I think that was probably fine when complaints were, and maybe it's still fine if complaints are relatively low level. And by low level, I mean low in terms of volume and complexity. But perhaps now is leading to a really difficult situation where a lot of very important and sensitive information is being scattered across different systems. And that leads to confusion. It could lead to a security issue, and it certainly leads to a dysfunctional process. When you're dealing with multiple staff, you're dealing with governors who need access, it becomes incredibly hard to maintain one single source of truth and make sure that everybody is seeing the same picture of that complaint. So from an operational point of view, that's incredibly challenging. And that's probably the best case scenario I can think of. Quite often schools are using written handwriting on bits of paper to manage their systems, which is about 20 years out of date. So on top of that manual issue, complaints, and that's more the operational side, I think it is important to talk about the emotional side, is that complaints are creating real stress for leaders. Head teachers have repeatedly told us that it's not necessarily the complexity of the complaint itself, it's the fear of missing something. So quite often, and you mentioned escalation of cases, a case may not be escalated because the head teacher's done something stupid or done something wrong, or spoken to a head teacher out of turn, or spoken to a parent out of turn, or not investigated something properly. Quite often the issue of escalation and then being upheld at a later stage by a stage 2 panel or a trust or whatever is because they may not have followed their process accurately. And that's, in a way, very understandable when you're using a very manual, time-heavy, admin-heavy process. And so for head teachers, it's the fear of missing something, the risk of breaching a deadline, and the emotional load of dealing with that conflict that's causing them to wake up in the middle of the night worrying about these things. I'm not saying all head teachers are doing that. That's the worst case scenario, but I would say it's more than any head teacher would want. So I think that's the issue for schools, and that's the issue for head teachers, is that dealing with the complaint on the front line, if you like, causes both operational and emotional stress. For MATs, you asked about MATs, and they are important. The challenge is for them is less those things, and it's more about visibility. So I'm not saying MATs aren't stressed, and their legal teams are definitely stressed, and the CEO will definitely be concerned about certain complaints that get very escalated very far, and often can go to the DFE and all sorts of things like that. And for MATs, they're responsible for oversight. And many trusts that we've spoken to, there isn't necessarily a standardized way of logging or tracking complaints. And then they only discover patterns, or only discover when something has escalated when it's too late. They're already 6 months into a debate with the school, the parent that is, and the MAT is kind of playing catch up from the earliest point they get involved. So that's the worst case scenario of MATs. It's fair to say that lots of MATs do already have something in place. And often it's a centralized spreadsheet. The head teacher is meant to log a complaint on the tracker, or a form maybe that the trust uses. And on paper, that system would give the trust the visibility it needs, but only if the head teacher uses it. And the problem is that bit in the middle where head teachers simply don't have the time or the headspace to fill out a reporting tool that doesn't actually help them resolve a complaint. So it becomes another admin burden. And yes, if the head teacher fills out that row in the spreadsheet, or sends that email, or updates that tracking tool, whatever it might be, they are giving the mat the visibility they want, but they're not actually solving the problem for themselves. And then if you picture the time now, what is it, a couple of weeks before Christmas? If a head teacher is thinking about all the things that they have to do, understandably, the complaint tracker for the mat falls to the bottom of their to-do list. And it's something that they then know they should do, but maybe isn't something that they feel they can do. And understandably, it falls to the bottom of the list. There is another dynamic as well that we've noticed, is that many heads don't want to report everything to the trust straight away. Not because they're hiding anything or because they feel guilty, but because it can feel like it's a bit like inviting scrutiny before they've had the chance to resolve an issue. And unless you're going to actually help the head teacher resolve that complaint, it can feel a bit just, like a bit big brothery. They'd rather get the problem under control first, the head teacher, and then update the trust in a measured way rather than, feel like they're doing the reporting before they've had a chance to resolve something.
Yeah.
So the MAT ends up with a system that technically exists but isn't consistently used. And that's not because leaders don't care, it's because the tool doesn't help them do the job in the moment. And so I think you ask about what schools and trusts can do to handle this problem better. And I think it's, for the MAT perspective, it's to understand the problem of your head teachers. Understand that you're not helping them by asking them to update a spreadsheet. You're helping them by supporting them with the complaint. And if you want them to update you more and acknowledge you more, you have to give them the motivation to do that. And so that's what Companion tries to do. Not to plug the app one more time, but we essentially are trying to bridge the gap by helping head teachers through the actual process, through the acknowledgement, through the planning, through the tracking, and helping them actually resolve the complaint. Because only by doing that can you then get the data that the trust wants to resolve the issues from their side.
Yeah, and Sam, I was going to just touch on that. You beat me to it. Ultimately, the goal is a successful resolution. That is, of course, what all of this is about, is a successful resolution to the parent complaint.
Yeah.
And you've hit the nail on the head, is ultimately that's the goal, that's the objective. And I'm sure that's from a parent perspective as well. Parents want to be heard, they want to voice their concerns, but ultimately they want an amicable resolution, as does everybody in the school. Of course they do. And you mentioned at multi-academy trust level, and you articulated it really, really well about the trust role to help and support that head or the person responsible for managing and resolving to a very high satisfactory level that parental complaint. And something that jumped into my mind as you were kindly sharing those experiences and feedback is putting myself in the position of a head teacher. I'm thinking of a large secondary school. My head would explode if I had to manage several simultaneous complaints, and also knowing if I didn't have a structure, a system, a process, an A to Z, how would I know which step I'm up to for each of the several complaints that I'm simultaneously managing? Am I at step one? Have I completed it? Am I fine to go to step two? And for complaint number two, am I near resolution stage? Have I missed something? So I guess, you spoke about being organized and efficient and knowing exactly where you are. I'm sure that's come through from some of your experience of talking to heads and MAT leaders too.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, head teachers understandably have a million things, different things going on, and it's hard to keep a track of what's going on. I think often head teachers don't feel like they can collaborate either. Quite often it feels to me, having spoken to head teachers, that they feel like they alone are the person that can deal with a complaint. And often the reason they feel that way is because it's so hard to share information that's going to be secure. How do you collaborate with a colleague when that colleague cannot know the full context of the complaint, but might be able to help you with certain tasks or certain challenges that you've got with it? And so quite often the whole complaint falls on the head teacher to resolve, and that can be incredibly daunting. And so one thing I would say is that if you can, and obviously I think using Companion is a brilliant way to do this, but there might be other ways if you can find them, is try and find ways that you can collaborate with fellow staff members. We found that quite often complaints are more quickly resolved and the outcomes are better if head teachers are better supported. Now, it can be by the MAT or it can be by their colleagues in the school itself, but something has to be created in order to facilitate that. And quite often the tools that schools are using do not enable that to happen, because if you're using a variety of different spreadsheets or notes or whatever, and everyone's using a different system, to handle a complaint, rather than logging it all in one central place, it becomes very difficult to communicate and difficult to collaborate with those challenges. So I don't think head teachers need to deal with the complaint all on their own. And quite often the most successful head teachers I've seen have found ways to share the load a bit more, either by reducing the amount of time they spend dealing with the complaint at a very early stage and trying to delegate that to a class teacher or something like that. Equally, you can get support from above if you have the right processes in place to collaborate with your MAT colleagues.
Thank you, Sam. And I think now is the perfect time, is the perfect interlink to talk about Companion. So, Sam, can you just talk us through the concept of Companion? Obviously, we spoke about the challenges schools have and everything from the challenging behaviours of managing complaints to the complexity to managing multiple simultaneously. But ultimately, if you can just share about how Companion continues to be a great support, a bit of a shoulder, a support mechanism for these head teachers and persons responsible for managing complaints.
Yeah. So I'm keen not to turn this into a bit of a product plug, but ultimately we believe that Companion is a really good solution to the problem that head teachers are facing. And there is no technical solution out there that's specifically designed to help schools deal with complaints, as far as I know. And Companion is designed to be a central source of truth which helps head teachers get their complaint from initial submission through to resolution. So throughout that process, we help them plan their investigation. We help them track their investigation. They are able to upload documents and attachments, both from the original complaint and from their evidence gathering, into Companion. We have AI built in to help you acknowledge emails, help you draft documents. The AI is designed never to replace you or make decisions on your behalf. It's only there to ever advise or guide or provide hints or prompts that you might want to then consider, and as well as helping you draft outcome reports that previously would have taken you weeks to assemble all of your evidence, as well as helping you collaborate, which we've already touched on already. It can then be used as a kind of data storage hub. So they can see all of their complaints in one place. They can see all of the reasons why those complaints have been submitted. So you may find that you've got 6 complaints from this term about behaviour, or you may find that you've got 7 complaints about bullying. And each school will be slightly different. So you can then say, okay, this school has got a certain number of complaints around this topic, and parents seemingly really care about that. How can we go and communicate that better to parents? How can we support our head teacher in making sure that is less of a problem in future? So right now, leaders are juggling a variety of different tools, none of which are fit for purpose. So inboxes, notes, forwarded emails, spreadsheets. With Companion, everything sits in one place. The communication, the timeline, the actions, the activity log, the documents, and all of that is shareable with you in control of the permission settings. So nothing gets lost. Everyone sees the same version of events, and you can invite and share details in a secure way without having to rely on forwarding email attachments and all that sort of different stuff that people are doing, or in the worst case, sharing handwritten documents. So our primary goal is to support the head teacher in the moment of handling the complaint. And the system helps them do that by logging the complaint properly. It suggests immediate next steps, drafts acknowledgements, and tracks the deadlines that they need to stick to, and helps them stick to their processes and their policies when previously they may have gone awry, because understandably policies are incredibly complicated, and not every head teacher has the time to study them in the level of detail that might be required. And when the head is supported, as I've said, 2 things happen. The issue is dealt with more quickly and consistently, and the outcome of that complaint is better and usually leads to a restoration of the relationship with the parent. And also the trust gets the accurate real-time data that they want. So in our system, MATs don't have to chase schools for updates. Schools don't need to feel policed, and it becomes a better partnership. And that's our vision for how we imagine and how we've seen people using Companion in real world situations.
So thank you, Simon. Listeners, I've actually had the luxury of seeing Companion live, and I must say, I would strongly suggest you have a look at it. Get in touch with Sam, have a look at the product. It is pretty exceptional.
Excellent. That's the kind of ringing endorsement we want. Thanks, Matt.
Well, more importantly than mine, the head teachers that I know have also seen it outside of the education showroom and via the education showroom have been incredibly impressed. That's both MAT leaders and head teachers. So listeners, I would love for you to get in touch with Sam, have a look at the website for Companion that Sam's going to share with you in a second. Have a look and see how it could benefit you as the head, your colleagues at senior leadership team level, and or yourself as a MAT leader. But it really is a very, very impressive bit of kit. Sam, on that note, website for people to have a look at, please.
Yes. So I really hope people are interested and want to learn more. If they are, you can visit us at educationcompanion.com. And if you'd like to get in touch either with us through the website, you can. But if you want to get in touch with me directly, my email is sam@educationcompanion.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Sam Flood. And obviously, you find me under the Companion LinkedIn page. And honestly, we're still, as I've said, we've had so many different conversations with head teachers, and we'd love to obviously sell the product to you, but I'd also just be really interested in, maybe I've said something today that you disagree with, or maybe I've said something that you don't think is quite right, or maybe I've said something that you didn't know and you didn't realize that some of your colleagues as head teachers might be thinking and doing some of the things that we've talked about. I'd be really interested to hear your opinions. And even if you don't want to engage with the product, I think the first things we did when we set up Companion was, how can we talk to head teachers and understand their problems as much as possible? And that's why we ended up building Companion, and that's how we ended up building a lot of the features that feature within the Companion app. So if nothing else, I'm always open for a conversation about this topic. I really care about it. And at the end of the day, I want to build something that will help head teachers handle this problem in a way that is more constructive for everybody.
Thank you, Sam. Listeners, thank you as always for joining us, whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Spotify. I hope you've enjoyed the content. And as Sam has offered, please get in touch with Sam. Any questions, any learnings, takeaways, anything you'd like to discuss, explore. If you'd like to have a look at Companion, if you'd like to debate anything that's been discussed today, you're very welcome to do so. Thank you as always for dialing in, tuning in, listening in, and we'll see you next week for the next podcast. That's Sam. Thank you for being today's special guest.
Thanks, Matt.